The beige cashmere wrap draped across Betty Miller's shoulders felt like armor today. She had earned this the quiet Saturday afternoon, the glossy shopping bags, the simple, sacred act of choosing something beautiful for herself without asking anyone's permission. 6 months of therapy. 6 months of rebuilding.
Get out of my way.
6 months
Who
of
do you
convincing
think you
herself
are?
that the woman who used to flinch at the
Don't look
sound
at
of a
me.
door slamming was gone. She was running her fingers along a silk blouse the color of champagne when the boutique's tall glass doors didn't swing open. They crashed. Betty didn't need to turn around. The sound hit her spine first, that specific, jagged slam of hinges pushed past their limit by a man who had never learned that doors, like people, deserved to be handled gently. The crystal chandeliers above her trembled, their light fracturing into 1,000 nervous diamonds across the white marble floor. Every conversation in the boutique evaporated. A sales associate's perfectly manicured hand froze mid-fold over a cashmere sweater. A woman near the accessories display pressed her fingers slowly to her mouth. Betty felt the air change. Not cool, not still, curdled, the way air only ever changes when one specific person walks into a room and poisons it from the doorway. No, her mind refused it. Not here, not this, but her body already knew. Her body had always known Dominic Cole before her eyes did. Betty. His voice didn't fill the room. It contaminated it loud, raw, the sound of a man who had never once been told that his rage was not the world's emergency. She heard him shoving through a clothing rack, the metallic shriek of hangers scraping, a young shopper gasping and stumbling sideways to clear his path. She turned. He was already close. Too close. Brown-patterned blazer, dark shirt, tan trousers, dressed like a man who thought appearance could disguise character. His eyes were wild and wet, the specific look she had spent 6 months trying to surgically remove from her memory, the look that always came before. You think running makes you free. His voice dropped to something worse than a shout, a hiss, thick with humiliation and hunger. You think some new clothes and some new zip code makes you someone different? Dominic. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Don't do this. He didn't hear her. He never did. His hand shot out not to grab her arm. Not this time, and with the full, careless force of a man asserting ownership, he shoved her. Betty's world tilted. The marble came up fast and merciless, cold and unforgiving against her palms, her hip, her whole right side. Her monogrammed Louis Vuitton bag hit the floor beside her with a hollow thud, its contents lip balm, her planner, 3 carefully saved business cards scattering across the polished white stone like evidence of a life interrupted. Gasps erupted around her. Hands flew to mouths. No one moved. Betty pushed herself up onto one arm, her long dark braids falling forward, her wide eyes blinking against the boutique's relentless clinical brightness. The ceiling lights swam above her. Dominic loomed over her, one arm still extended, breathing hard, his posture a masterclass in entitled violence, leaning forward, dominant, certain that she had nowhere to go. He was still talking. She couldn't hear the words anymore. There was a ringing in her ears, and a heat in her palms from the marble, and a shame so deep and old it felt like a second skeleton inside her. And then she saw him. He had been there the whole time. She simply hadn't noticed him, the way you don't notice a fault line until the earth moves. He was standing perfectly still in the center of the boutique floor, perhaps 15 feet away, an East Asian man with sleek, jet-black hair and a face so composed it looked like it had been carved from something colder than stone. His navy suit was immaculate, every line of it falling with the precise geometry of something that cost more than some people's cars. A crisp white dress shirt, a dark tie, knotted without a single flaw. And on his left wrist, catching the chandelier light like a quiet signal, a silver luxury watch that did not hurry. Everyone else in that boutique was frozen in panic. This man was frozen in something else entirely. His dark eyes moved from Dominic to Betty, then back to Dominic. The clinical patience in his gaze was the most frightening thing Betty had ever seen, and she had seen Dominic at his worst. Slowly, deliberately, the man brought both hands to the front of his navy jacket. His fingers found the single button at his waist. and he began to fasten it, not rushing, not flinching. Just that one quiet, unhurried gesture, like a surgeon snapping on a glove, like a man who had just made a decision and was simply preparing. The silver watch caught the light one more time as his hands dropped back to his sides. Betty didn't know his name yet. She didn't know that the boutique's marble floor she was sitting on was his floor. She didn't know that the chandeliers above her head hung in a building his syndicate used to clean money that moved between 3 continents. She didn't know that she had been carefully, quietly observed for 6 weeks by men. She had never noticed men who had reported her sharp mind and unbroken resilience back to the man, now standing before her like a storm that had chosen, for now, not to break. She didn't know any of that. All Betty Miller knew in that cold and glittering moment was that the man in the navy suit was looking at Dominic the way a verdict looks at a guilty man. And Dominic, for the first time in the 6 years she had known him, looked uncertain. May J took one step forward. Just one, and the entire room seemed to exhale. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. May J's second step was quieter than his first. That was the thing Betty would remember later, not the violence that followed, but the silence that preceded it. The way the man in the navy suit moved through the boutique's frozen tableau like water finding the lowest point in a room, unhurried, inevitable. As though Dominic's rage was not an emergency but merely a scheduling inconvenience. Dominic saw him coming and did what Dominic always did when he sensed a threat he hadn't anticipated. He puffed up, shoulders back, chin forward, the brown patterned blazer stretching across his frame as he turned to face the approaching man with the particular arrogance of someone who had never once lost a confrontation he'd initiated. "You got a problem, man?" Dominic's voice had that warning frequency in it, the one Betty had learned to recognize the way some people learn to recognize the smell of smoke. "Walk away. This is between me and—" May J didn't walk away. He also didn't run, didn't shout, didn't reach into a pocket or signal to anyone. He simply arrived within arm's reach of Dominic Cole and stopped. And the quality of his stillness in that proximity was so profoundly wrong, so cosmically mismatched with the situation, that Dominic actually stopped talking. For 3 full seconds, the 2 men simply looked at each other. Then May J spoke. 2 words, low and flat, carrying all the emotional weight of a closing door. "Move back." Dominic laughed that short, disbelieving bark that Betty recognized as the last sound before things escalated. His hand came up, reaching for May J's lapel, fingers closing around the navy fabric of that immaculate suit jacket, with the same careless force he applied to everything he touched. What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds. Betty watched from the marble floor, still propped on one arm, her braids curtaining her face, and she could not afterward have explained it in a way that made complete sense. There was no dramatic wind-up, no telegraphed swing, no movie-style exchange of blows. May J's left hand closed around Dominic's outstretched wrist with a grip that looked almost gentle. There was a rotation, small, precise, the kind of movement that looked like nothing until it produced a sound that was definitely something. Dominic's knees buckled, his free hand shot out, grasping at empty air. May J stepped to the side with the casual economy of a man sidestepping a puddle, and Dominic went down, not crashing, not dramatic, just down his tan trousers, meeting the same cold marble that had met Betty's palms 60 seconds earlier. May J adjusted his lapel where Dominic had grabbed it. Dominic tried to rise. May J crouched beside him in one fluid motion, and whatever he said next, he said it quietly enough that only Dominic could hear. Betty watched Dominic's face change, the rage draining out of it like color from a wound, replaced by something she had genuinely never seen there before. Fear. Clean, clarifying, absolute fear. Dominic did not get up. 2 men materialized from the periphery of the boutique. They had been there all along, Betty realized. Positioned near the entrance and beside a display of leather accessories. Dressed well enough to pass for high-end shoppers, they reached Dominic efficiently, without theater, and guided him toward a back corridor that Betty hadn't noticed existed. A door she hadn't known was there swallowed all three of them, and then the boutique was quiet, except for the faint sound of someone near the accessories display, finally releasing a breath they'd been holding. May J. rose. He straightened his already straight tie. Then he turned to Betty and extended his hand, not rushed, not performative, simply offered. A hand wearing a silver watch that caught the chandelier light one more time. Betty looked at it for a moment. Then she took it. His grip was firm and dry, and gave nothing away. He drew her to her feet with a single, controlled motion, and when she was standing, he released her hand immediately, not holding on a second longer than the task required. "Your bag," he said. A woman young, dark-suited, appearing from nowhere with the practiced invisibility of someone professionally trained in it, had already gathered Betty's spilled belongings and restored them to the Louis Vuitton bag. She offered it to Betty with both hands and a small, composed nod. Betty took it. Her fingers were trembling. The 3 business cards she'd been carrying were gone, not in the bag, not on the floor. She didn't ask about them. She pressed them against the bag's leather to hide it. "Are you injured?" May J's voice was the same temperature it had been when he'd spoken to Dominic. Not warm, not cold, simply precise. "No," Betty said. Then, because her body was still processing everything and her mouth was working slightly ahead of her judgment, "Who are you?" He looked at her for a moment with those dark, measuring eyes. Not unkind, not kind either. Somewhere in between, in a territory that had no name she recognized. "Somewhere more private," he said. "I'll answer that." The room he led her to was behind the boutique's back wall, accessed through a door disguised as a floor-to-ceiling mirror. Betty noted this, filed it in the part of her brain that had spent 6 years cataloging exits and hidden things and followed him anyway. Because her legs were still unsteady and the alternative was standing alone on that marble floor where she had just been knocked down, and she could not do that. The space beyond the mirror was not a stock room. It was an office. Clean-lined, understated, expensive in the way that required no announcement. A low, ebony desk, 2 chairs upholstered in charcoal wool, a wall of security monitors displaying every angle of the boutique floor in cool, silent detail. Betty looked at the monitors and understood, with a slow-rolling certainty, that this man had watched the entire scene from here before walking out onto the floor, that his entrance had not been reactive. It had been chosen. She sat in the chair, he indicated. A woman different from the one who had collected her bag. Same quality of invisible competence, set a glass of water on the desk in front of her, and disappeared. May J remained standing. He had not sat down. He stood on the other side of the desk with his hands loosely clasped behind his back, regarding Betty with the focused patience of a man who had all the time in the world and had made a private decision about how he intended to use it. "The boutique belongs to me," he said. "My name is May J." Betty wrapped both hands around the water glass. The cold of it helped. "May J," she repeated, "and the men who took him through that door are handling the situation. Handling it how?" A pause, not evasive, considered, in a way that ensures he won't return to this building. Betty set the glass down. Outside this room, through the monitors, she could see the boutique floor returning to something resembling normal staff moving carefully. A few remaining customers drifting toward the exit with the slightly dazed expressions of people who had witnessed something they would spend the evening deciding whether to describe accurately. "You should know," she said, keeping her voice level, "that he's done this before. Not here, but places like it. And he always comes back." May J looked at her steadily. "Not to places like this," he said. There was something in the simplicity of it, the complete absence of doubt that Betty's nervous system didn't know what to do with. She had heard reassurances before, from police officers filing reports, from friends promising it would get better, from her own reflection, some mornings, lying to herself in the bathroom mirror. Reassurances always had a texture of hoping underneath them, a soft, uncertain foundation. May J's words had no such texture. They were load-bearing. She looked at the monitors again. at the four angles of the space she had thought was simply a beautiful boutique. At the men she could now identify near the entrance, and the accessories display still there, still positioned with that careful, deliberate casualness. "This isn't just a boutique," she said. It wasn't a question. May J's expression did not change. "No," he said. "It isn't." He moved to the door. "You'll be escorted to your car. My people will follow you home and ensure you arrive safely." "I didn't agree to that." "No," he said again. "You didn't." He paused at the door, his hand resting against the frame, and looked back at her one final time. "But I'm telling you, miss." Miller not asking, "Because tonight I'd prefer to know you're safe." He left before she could respond to that. Betty sat alone in the charcoal chair, beneath the cold glow of 12 security monitors, holding a glass of water with hands that had almost stopped shaking, and tried to decide whether she had just been rescued or acquired. She was not certain the two things were different. The black car that followed her home that evening kept a careful 3-vehicle distance. Betty watched it in her rearview mirror the entire 40 minutes from the boutique to her apartment, and when she pulled into her building's garage, it stopped at the mouth of the entrance and waited until her car disappeared inside before pulling smoothly away. She sat in the parked car for 6 minutes before going upstairs. That night, she called the police. Not because she believed it would accomplish anything. 6 months ago she had filed a report. 2 years ago she had filed a report. 3 years ago she had filed the first report. And Dominic Cole remained a free man with a phone and a temper, and an unshakable conviction that Betty Miller was his property, but because her therapist had told her to document everything, and the habit of documentation was one of the few that had survived intact from her previous life. The officer who answered was professionally sympathetic. He took her statement. He noted the boutique address. He told her someone might follow up within 72 hours regarding the incident. "He physically assaulted me in a public place with 30 witnesses," Betty said. "Yes, ma'am. We'll do our best to prioritize." She ended the call before he finished the sentence. She lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, and what she kept returning to, what her mind kept circling back to the way a tongue finds a sore tooth, was not Dominic's hand shoving her to the floor. It was May J's hand, offered to lift her from it. And the way he had said tonight, "I'd prefer to know you're safe," not, "I hope or I'll try, but I'd prefer," as though her safety was a preference he was fully equipped to enforce. She slept poorly. But she slept. The 72 hours came and went. No follow-up call from the police. What arrived instead, on the 3rd morning, was a text from her friend Camille. "Hey, don't freak out, but Dominic was parked outside my building last night. He didn't do anything, just sat there. My neighbor saw him. He left after like an hour. Thought you should know." Betty read the message 3 times. Then she called Camille, who answered on the first ring and tried very hard to sound unbothered and failed completely. "He was just sitting there," Camille said. "Marcus said the car didn't move for almost an hour. Then it just drove away." "Did you call the police?" A pause that said everything. "I mean, what would I even say, Betty? He sat in a car? He didn't do anything. He was just sending a message," Betty finished quietly. She knew how Dominic operated. The calls that hung up when answered, the car idling on a street you didn't expect, the roses left on a doorstep with no note, because the note was unnecessary. The point was simply the demonstration that he knew where you were. He had never needed to touch anyone other than Betty to control her world. He simply made everyone in it feel watched. She called her other friend, Priya, that afternoon with a casual question about weekend plans, and learned within 2 minutes that Dominic had walked into Priya's workplace, a dental office on the north side, asking for Betty's new address. He'd been polite, charming even, told the receptionist he was her cousin. The receptionist hadn't given anything away, but the fact of his presence there, of his systematic movement through the geography of Betty's support system, she felt it like a net being drawn slowly tighter. She filed another police report. This time she didn't wait for a callback that wouldn't come. She sat at her kitchen counter that evening with her laptop open and a cup of tea growing cold beside it. And she looked at the card that had been tucked quietly into her restored Louis Vuitton bag. She'd found it 3 days ago, nestled between her lip balm and her planner, placed there by invisible hands. The dark-suited woman who had gathered her belongings from the boutique floor, the one with the composed nod and the both-handed offering, had placed it there, Betty now understood, on instruction. A single heavy card, matte black, with a number embossed in clean silver type. No name, no title, no explanation. She hadn't called it. She called it now. It rang once. Miss Miller. Not a question. He had known, before she spoke a word, that it was her. The realization settled over her with a weight that was equal parts unsettling and, underneath that, something she was not quite ready to name. "He's going after my friends," she said. No preamble, no social cushioning. She had learned, from 30 seconds of interaction, that May was not a man who required either. He went to Priya's workplace. He sat outside Camille's building for an hour. The police have done nothing and will do nothing. Silence on the line, not empty, occupied. She could feel him thinking or deciding or doing whatever it was that happened behind those dark, calculating eyes when information was presented to him. "Are you safe where you are now? For tonight? Then sleep," he said. "I'll be in touch tomorrow morning." The call ended. Betty sat with the phone in her hand and found, to her own bewilderment, that her heart rate had slowed rather than quickened. She went to bed. She slept better than she had in a week. He sent a car at 9 the next morning. Not a text, not a call, a car. A black one, idling at her building's entrance when she looked through the lobby's glass doors, a driver standing beside it with the patient. Practiced stillness of someone who worked for a man who did not tolerate impatience. There was a note on her phone, a message from the same black card number, sent at 8:55. "When you're ready." Betty looked at the car. She thought about Camille's building and Priya's receptionist and the 72-hour follow-up call that had never come. She thought about 6 years of playing by rules that only she seemed obligated to follow. She went downstairs. The car took her not to the boutique, but to a building 3 blocks east of it, narrower, older, its exterior the kind of unremarkable that only ever results from deliberate effort. A Korean restaurant occupied the ground floor, its signage modest, its windows slightly fogged with warmth. The driver opened the car door, gestured toward the restaurant entrance, and then stood precisely where he was. Inside, the restaurant was closed to the public at this hour, its tables bare and its kitchen quiet. But in the back room, real walls, no mirrors this time, though Betty checked May was already seated at a round table set for 2, with tea poured and his jacket hung with geometric precision over the back of his chair. Without it, he wore just the white dress shirt and dark tie, the silver watch catching the low amber lighting of the room. He looked, somehow, no less formidable for having removed one layer. He indicated the chair across from him. Betty sat. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I want to know what you are," Betty said. "Actually, not boutique owner. Not, I'll handle the situation. What you actually are." May regarded her. Then he picked up his tea, took a measured sip, and set the cup back down with the same finality she'd watched him give everything he touched. "I run an organization," he said. "It operates in several industries, some of which are legitimate and some of which are not. The boutique is one of our legitimate fronts among other functions." A pause. "My organization has significant reach, financial, logistical, and otherwise." Betty absorbed this with the careful attention she'd once applied to quarterly reports and budget forecasts, the part of her brain that had built a career out of reading between lines, engaging automatically. "When you say organization," she said slowly, "you mean a syndicate?" He did not look away. "Yes, Korean Mafia. A beat. That is one way people refer to it." The room was very quiet. Outside, faint kitchen sounds, someone preparing for the lunch service, indifferent to the conversation happening 20 feet away. Betty looked at her own tea, at the careful way it had been poured, at the table set for 2 with the unhurried certainty of a man who had known she would come. "You were watching me," she said. "Before the boutique, before Dominic showed up." Mei J's expression shifted the smallest possible degree, a fractional recalibration. Yes, he said. For how long? 6 weeks. The number landed squarely. Betty breathed through it. Why? He folded his hands on the table, and in the amber light she could see the architecture of his stillness clearly. It wasn't the stillness of a man suppressing emotion. It was the stillness of a man who had, long ago, brought every part of himself completely under his own authority. My organization's financial infrastructure requires a specific kind of mind, he said. Precise, adaptive, capable of maintaining composure under pressure and identifying patterns that others miss. I've seen your professional history, Miss Miller. Your work at Hargrove Capital before you left. The independent consulting you built afterward. The way you continued building it while managing a situation at home that would have dismantled most people entirely. Betty was very still now, in her own way. You weren't a coincidence in my boutique, Mei Jay continued. I had been intending to approach you through legitimate channels. What your ex-boyfriend did accelerated the timeline. You were going to recruit me, Betty said. I am recruiting you, he said. Now, formally. The silence stretched between them, and Betty let it stretch, because she had learned in 6 years of surviving a man who weaponized urgency that patience was the most subversive power available to her. She looked at Mei Jay across the small table at the composed certainty of him, at the silver watch, at the jacket hung with military precision over the chair back, and she thought about Dominic sitting outside Camille's building for an hour in the dark, just to prove he could. What does recruitment look like? She asked. A position within my inner circle. Access to resources you currently don't have. Financial compensation that would make your current consulting income look modest. He paused. And the kind of protection that doesn't file reports and wait 72 hours. And in exchange, your mind, your skills, your loyalty. And my ethics? Mei Jay looked at her steadily. You'd have to decide what those are worth to you, he said, measured against what they've cost you so far. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in months. The brutal, unvarnished arithmetic of it, what her rules had gotten her, weighed against what breaking them might cost, was more clarifying than any reassurance she'd been offered by people who meant well and couldn't deliver. She did not say yes. She was not ready to say yes, but she looked at him and said, I need to think. Of course, he said. While I'm thinking, she continued, and here she felt something shift in her own chest, a door, long locked, opening a careful inch. There's something I want to ask you. He waited. Dominic isn't stopping, she said. He's methodical when he's angry. He'll keep moving through my life, through the people I care about, until he finds the right pressure point. The police are useless. Court orders are paper. She paused. You said your organization has reach. Logistical reach. Surveillance capability. Yes, Mei Jay said. I want to know where he is, Betty said. At any given time. Where he goes, who he talks to, what he's planning. I want to know before he moves. The quality of Mei Jay's attention sharpened a barely perceptible thing, like a lens clicking into perfect focus. He was looking at her differently now. Not with surprise, she suspected very little surprised him, but with something that looked, in the amber light of that quiet back room, very much like confirmation, like she had just proved something he had already believed. You understand, he said carefully, that what you're asking for is not something a private citizen requests through legal means. I know exactly what I'm asking for, Betty said. I've spent 6 years trying the legal means. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people arriving, from different directions, at the same coordinate. Mei Jay reached inside his shirt pocket and set a small device on the table between them, a phone, matte black, unmarked. He slid it across the table with one finger. His location, as of this morning, he said, is already on that phone, updated every 4 hours. Betty looked at the phone, then at him. You already had it running, she said. I told you, Mei Jay said. I'd prefer to know you're safe. Betty picked up the phone. Her hand did not tremble. She turned it over once in her palm, this small, matte black, utterly illegal thing, and felt the precise weight of what she had just crossed into. Not the weight of guilt, not regret, something more clarifying than either. The specific gravity of a decision made by someone who has finally, after years of waiting for the world to protect her, decided to stop waiting. She looked at May J. across the table. "Tell me more about the position," she said. And for the first time since she had laid eyes on him, on that boutique floor standing perfectly still while the world panicked around him, fastening the button of a navy suit with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already decided how the situation would end, the corner of May J's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that, and for precisely that reason, far more devastating. "I thought you needed to think," he said. "I thought about it," Betty said. Outside, the kitchen sounds continued their indifferent rhythm. The amber light held steady. The silver watch marked the passing of a moment that Betty Miller would later identify with the clear-eyed precision that May J had already recognized in her as the last moment of her previous life. She did not mourn it. The education did not look the way Betty had expected. She had braced herself for something cinematic weapons training in a basement, perhaps, or encrypted ledgers slid across a desk with clipped instructions about offshore accounts. What May J gave her instead was subtler, and in its subtlety far more transformative. It began with a meeting. 3 weeks after the restaurant conversation, May J brought her into a room with 6 men, senior figures in his organization's financial architecture. She understood, though no one offered titles or surnames. They were variously aged, variously dressed, uniformly watchful. They sat around an oval table in one of May J's legitimate properties, a private members club on the 14th floor of a building that had no signage indicating a private members club existed, and May J introduced Betty without preamble or excessive context. "She'll be reviewing the hospitality portfolio," he said. "Answer her questions completely," and then he sat at the head of the table and said nothing else for the duration of the meeting. He simply watched. Betty understood, within the first 4 minutes, that the meeting was not about the hospitality portfolio. It was about her specifically, about whether she would fold under the weight of 6 sets of carefully neutral male eyes, each one calibrated to communicate, without words, that she did not belong in that room, and that the man who had brought her there was indulging a curiosity that would resolve itself. She did not fold. She asked precise questions. She identified, within 20 minutes, a structural inefficiency in the revenue reporting across 3 properties that the men around the table had either missed or quietly ignored. She laid it out without apology, without hedging, and watched 2 of the 6 recalibrate the way they were looking at her, the shift from dismissal to something more cautious, more attentive. After the meeting, when the 6 men had filed out with the contained energy of people who had not expected the hour to go the way it had, May J remained at the table. He was looking at her across the length of it with the same focused quality he'd had in the restaurant. "You already knew about the reporting inefficiency," Betty said. "Before I found it." "Yes," he said. "You wanted to see if I'd find it." "I wanted to see," he said, "how you'd handle the room. The inefficiency was incidental." Betty gathered her notes. "And?" May J stood, straightening his jacket navy again today. A different cut, the same precise effect. "You didn't ask for their approval," he said. "You didn't perform confidence. You simply operated." A pause. "That's rarer than people believe." He moved toward the door, and Betty fell into step beside him, not behind. She noticed, and he did not seem to expect her behind him, and as they walked, he said, "Fear and respect are not the same currency, but they spend similarly in the short term. The difference is that fear requires maintenance. Someone will always test it. Respect, if it's genuine, compounds." "Which do your men have for you?" Betty asked. "Both," he said, "in the correct proportions." She thought about that for the rest of the day. The education continued like this, oblique, precise, delivered in the spaces between operational tasks that were real and had real consequences. She spent a week learning the architecture of legitimate businesses that existed primarily to justify the movement of money that had no legitimate origin. She learned the vocabulary of layering, of placement, of the clean surface that concealed the depth beneath. She was good at it, startlingly good, with the fluid ease of someone whose professional brain had been built for exactly this kind of structural thinking, simply applied now in a direction that no compliance officer would sanction. May J watched her work the way, she imagined, a jeweler watches a stone being cut with the contained satisfaction of someone whose judgment about raw material has been confirmed. The tension between them built the way pressure builds in a sealed room, not dramatically, not with declaration, but through accumulation, the way he sometimes stood closer than strictly necessary when reviewing her work, the way she had stopped registering his proximity as unusual. The evening he drove her himself, no driver, just the two of them in the black car, the city moving past the windows, and they talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the organization. And she laughed at something he said, and then looked at him, and found him already looking at her with that unreadable stillness, and neither of them addressed it, but neither of them pretended it hadn't happened either. She was pulling on her coat to leave his office one evening when he said, without looking up from what he was reading, "You're not afraid of me." Betty paused with one arm in the sleeve. "Should I be? Most people are. Most people haven't watched you iron out a suit button while someone was screaming," she said. "It's hard to fear someone once you've noticed their habits." He looked up then. The amber desk lamp caught the angles of his face, the clean line of his jaw, the dark eyes that were, she had learned, not cold but simply uncluttered. Uncluttered by pretense, by performance, by the social static that most people used to obscure what they actually thought. "What habits?" he said, and there was something in it not quite amusement, but its sophisticated older sibling. "You always adjust your left cuff first," Betty said. "You pour your own tea before anyone else's, even when someone else is pouring. When you're processing something important, you go very still, stiller than usual, for exactly long enough that someone who wasn't paying attention would miss it." A silence. "You've been paying attention," he said. "Occupational adaptation," she said. "I spent 6 years monitoring someone for early warning signs. Apparently the skill transfers." Something moved through his expression. She caught it, and lost it in the same instant, like a reflection in disturbed water. When he spoke again, his voice had the same measured quality it always had, but underneath it, something that was not quite distance. "Go home, Betty," he said. "Sleep. Tomorrow is complicated." She went home. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark thinking about the way her name sounded when he said it, not Miss Miller, which was how he'd begun, but Betty, which was how he'd been ending lately, and the difference between the two was a distance she had not intended to notice and could not now unnotice. Tomorrow arrived and was, as promised, complicated. She was at the Members Club May J's office on the 14th floor, reviewing variance reports across the restaurant group when the call came in. Not to her. She was aware of it only because she heard May J's voice change in the adjacent room, a shift in register so slight that 2 months ago she would have missed it entirely. She looked up from the laptop. Through the half-open office door she could see him standing at his desk, phone against his ear, and he was wearing the stillness, that particular, specific stillness she had catalogued that meant something important was being processed. He opened the office door 90 seconds later. "There's been an incident at the Sora Gallery," he said. The Sora Gallery was one of the organization's art-facing legitimate fronts on the East Side, a real gallery, representing real artists, serving also as a real and functional component of a much larger financial mechanism. 3 men came through the service entrance 40 minutes ago. They moved through the staff area. 2 employees were frightened. No one was seriously hurt. A pause, measured and deliberate. "They were looking for you." Betty closed the laptop. "Dominic sent them." "The men are being interviewed currently," May J said, and the particular weight he placed on interviewed required no elaboration. "They confirmed they were hired through a third party, 2 days ago. Cash." The instruction was to locate you and make contact. Make contact, Betty repeated. That was the phrasing they used. Yes. She stood, walked to the window. The city below moved in its indifferent afternoon rhythm, taxis and pedestrians, and the ordinary machinery of a world that had no idea what was conducting itself 14 floors above it. Dominic had escalated. Not to her directly, not yet, but to the infrastructure around her, probing for a gap in the perimeter the way he'd always probed for gaps. Methodically, with a patience that looked like recklessness but was, in fact, deeply, chillingly strategic. He was not going to stop. He had never been someone who stopped. Every restraining order, every distance she had put between them, every fresh start she had constructed, he had treated each one as a puzzle to solve, rather than a boundary to respect. The matte black phone was in her jacket pocket. She had checked his location that morning, a habit now, like checking the weather, and he had been at an address in the North Quarter she'd identified as a secondary contact's apartment, someone he was using as a base. He's not going to keep sending proxies, she said to the window. That's not how he operates. The proxies are reconnaissance. He's mapping the territory, finding out where I am, what the access points look like, who's around me. She paused. The next move will be him, personally. Behind her, May J said nothing. She had learned that his silences were participatory. He was listening at a depth that made most people's attention feel like skimming. I want to end this, Betty said. She turned from the window. Not manage it. Not adjust to it. End it. Permanently. May J looked at her steadily. What are you proposing? Betty had been turning the shape of it over in her mind for days, since the text from Camille, since Priya's receptionist, since the sleepless nights that preceded the restaurant meeting. The outline of it had been forming the way scar tissue forms, gradually, from damage, into something harder than what it replaced. He's been trying to find me, she said. What if I let him? She laid it out across the next 2 hours, at the oval table in the members' club, with May J across from her and 2 of his senior operational people flanking him, a compact man called Shin, who handled logistics, and a woman named Park Soo who had the pleasant face of a schoolteacher and the eyes of someone who had made a great many irreversible decisions. Betty had met Park Soo only once before, briefly, during a financial review in May J's second-floor office, a woman who had said 4 words, absorbed everything, and left the room feeling somehow smaller than when she'd entered it. Betty walked them through the plan without notes, because she had built it in her head, and it lived there cleanly. Dominic was looking for her at May J's properties. He'd found the gallery, which meant he had partial intelligence on the organization's legitimate front network, which meant someone had talked or someone had been careless, either of which was a solvable problem. He would keep working the list until he found her or found an exploitable gap. She would give him neither. She would give him something better, a controlled opportunity, a property on the network that appeared, to anyone conducting exterior reconnaissance, to be lightly staffed and logistically isolated. She would be seen entering it. She would be seen appearing to be alone, or nearly alone, in a space that a man like Dominic would read as an opportunity. He would come himself. She was certain of it. The proxies had been information gathering when he moved directly. It was always because he believed the advantage was his. He would come to a building that was not, in any meaningful sense, lightly staffed. He would come to a building that had been precisely prepared for his arrival, and he would find that the gap he had identified was not a gap at all, but a door held open by someone who had finally stopped running. Shin asked 3 logistical questions, all of which Betty answered without hesitation. Park Soo asked none, which Betty had come to understand was Park Soo's form of approval. Then they both looked at May J. May J had been watching Betty throughout the presentation with that focused, uncluttered attention. Now he was quiet for a moment still, in the specific way she'd catalogued, and when he spoke it was not to his operational people. You understand what this requires of you, he said to Betty. Not logistically. Personally. I understand, she said. Once you're inside this, he said, there is no version of it that ends with you on the outside of it. You won't be able to unknow what you know or undo what you do. I know that. Tell me you know it clearly, he said. Not theoretically. Betty looked at him across the table, at the composure of him, the steadiness, the dark eyes that were asking her a real question and would accept nothing less than a real answer. 6 years, she said. 6 years of police reports and court dates and new apartments and new phone numbers and the absolute unshakable belief that if I just played by the rules hard enough, the rules would eventually protect me. She paused. They didn't. He's sending men into buildings where your staff work. He will not stop until something stops him. I am choosing to be the thing that stops him. Another pause. That's not theoretical. The room was quiet. May J held her gaze for a long moment. Then he gave a single, precise nod, the kind that closed a subject permanently. Shin, he said. Prepare the Hanul property. The Hanul property was a logistics company that occupied the ground floor of a low-rise commercial building on the west edge of the business district, unglamorous, functional, the kind of building that registered as background in a cityscape. Its legitimate operation involved freight documentation. Its other operations involved the kind of freight that did not appear in documentation. It had a reception area, a warehouse section, a back-office corridor, and, Betty now knew, a basement level that appeared on no building plan she could find in any civic record. She arrived at the Hanul building on a Thursday morning at 9:45, as planned, in a car that was not black and not one of May J's. She had dressed the way she might dress on a normal working day, dark cardigan, beige trousers, her Louis Vuitton bag on her arm. Because the bag was visible, and Dominic had seen the bag, and it would read to anyone watching as Betty Miller, moving normally through her day, insufficiently careful. She spent 40 minutes inside, visible at the reception window twice, moving through the space in a pattern that looked organic and was entirely choreographed. Then she settled in the back office to wait. The matte black phone told her Dominic's location had moved at 10:22. At 10:51 it moved again closer. At 11:15 it was stationary, 2 blocks from the Hanul building, which was the behavior of someone conducting a final assessment of a target location. Betty looked at the phone's screen for a long moment, at the blinking dot of him, at the 2-block distance between his current certainty and his coming catastrophic miscalculation. She put the phone face down on the desk. May J was in the building. She knew this without being told, had known it since she'd arrived and registered the quality of stillness in the back corridor, the kind that only exists when someone very controlled is deliberately making themselves invisible. He was there, she understood, not to intervene. He had been explicit about that. This is your trap, he had said the night before, when they had gone over the final details in his office and the city had been dark outside the windows. I'll be there, but the authority in that room is yours. She had asked him why. Why give her the authority? Why not simply handle it with the efficiency he'd applied to every other threat she'd encountered since the boutique? He had looked at her for a moment. Because Dominic Cole needs to be stopped by you, he said. Not by me. Not for legal reasons. For yours. She had thought about that all night. At 11:31, she heard the building's service entrance. Not forced, someone had given Dominic or his contact a method of access that looked like a vulnerability, a side door with a lock that responded to a code that should not have been obtainable and had been arranged to be obtainable. Shin had handled that part, a leaked code, passed through 2 intermediaries to a contact of Dominic's she had identified from 3 weeks of location data, untraceable back to the building's actual ownership. He would feel clever for having it. He was not clever. He was exactly where they needed him. She heard footsteps in the corridor. One set, then a pause, then one set again. He had come alone, which she had predicted and May J had confirmed was consistent with his behavioral pattern when he believed the advantage was absolute. Dominic Cole alone was the full expression of Dominic Cole. He had never needed an audience for the violence. He had only needed a witness for the power. The office door opened. He looked, for a single, disorienting moment, smaller than she remembered. It was the first time she had seen him since the boutique floor, and the boutique had its own distortions, her own terror magnifying him, the marble cold beneath her, his silhouette looming from that particular angle of powerlessness. Here, standing in a doorway in a logistics company in the West Business District, he was simply a man in a dark jacket who had made a catastrophic navigational error. But his face, when he registered her composure, when he saw that she was seated, not cowering, not scrambling, not reaching for a phone to beg someone for help, did something she had not seen it do in 6 years. It flickered. Betty. His voice found its register, the low, intimate one, the one that came before the other one. "You knew I'd come." "Yes," she said. "Then you know this is over." "All of this," he gestured vaguely at the room, meaning her, meaning the life she had been building, meaning whatever new territory she had moved into that he had spent 2 months trying to map and infiltrate. "You can't hide in his shadow. You can't use his people to run from me. You think he cares about you? You're Dominic," Betty said. He stopped. She had never, not in 6 years, interrupted him. The simple fact of it seemed to physically reorganize the air in the room. "Sit down," she said. He didn't sit, but he didn't move forward either, and the flicker in his face became something more sustained, a fault line spreading. "There are people in this building," Betty said, "who have been waiting for you to walk through that service entrance since 11 o'clock this morning. Not security guards. Not police." She paused, letting that settle with the patience of someone who has finally, completely, stopped being in a hurry. "You hired 3 men to go into the Sora gallery. Those men are not available to you now." His jaw tightened. "You think a suit is going to—" "I think you should listen to me," Betty said, "more carefully than you have ever listened to me in your life, because what happens in the next 5 minutes is going to be determined by whether you can manage that." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Then, from the corridor, unhurried, deliberate, announced only by the soft sound of a well-made shoe on a concrete floor, May J appeared in the doorway behind Dominic. He had not rushed. He simply arrived, the way he arrived at everything, as though the timeline of events had been arranged around his schedule and was proceeding correctly. He was wearing the navy suit. He did not touch Dominic. He stood behind him, equidistant from the door and from Betty's desk, and the quality of his presence in that small office was the quality of a sealed room. All the air pressure shifted, and there was nowhere for anything to go. Dominic turned, saw May J, turned back to Betty, and Betty watched, with the clear-eyed precision that had been sharpening itself for 3 months in the amber-lit rooms of May J's world. As 6 years of Dominic Cole's certainty about himself collapsed inward like a condemned building, not dramatically, not with a crash, but with the quiet, inevitable subsidence of a structure whose foundation has finally failed. She stood up. She had not planned to stand. It happened on its own, her body understanding, before her mind articulated it, that this was the moment she had been on the floor for, that she had been shoved down so that she could choose, with full knowledge and full authority, to stand up. She looked at Dominic for a long time, at the man who had been the organizing principle of her fear for the better part of a decade. He looked, she thought again, smaller, not because he had changed, because she had. "I want to be clear," she said, "not for your sake, for mine." She held his gaze with the steadiness she had learned sitting across from May J in amber-lit rooms. "You're done. Not paused, not redirected. Done. Every resource you might use to approach me or anyone connected to me is now visible to people who do not observe the limits that have protected you until today." She picked up the matte black phone from the desk. She set it down again, facing up, so the blinking dot of his location was visible. She let him look at it. "You've been on that screen," she said, "for 3 months." Dominic said nothing. It was, she thought, the first time she had seen him without a word. The rage that had always been his idiom, the volume that had always been his authority, absent. In their place, something rawer and more honest than anything he had offered in 6 years. "He gets to keep breathing," Betty said, not to Dominic, to May J, and felt, as she said it, the full weight of the authority those words implied. The authority to say keep and have it be absolute. He gets to leave this building and spend the rest of his life knowing exactly how close he came to the alternative. That's sufficient. May J, from the doorway, said nothing, but his eyes on her, steady, with that focused quality she had catalogued from the first moment, held something she had no word for yet, but recognized the way you recognize a language you have not yet learned to speak. He gave the single nod, the one that closed things permanently. Shin materialized from somewhere in the corridor, with two other men Betty recognized from the Hanul building's arranged staff. They collected Dominic with the efficient, impersonal professionalism of people for whom this kind of transaction was administrative rather than personal. She heard them in the corridor, and then she heard the service entrance, and then she heard nothing except the low ambient sounds of a building going about its other business. Somewhere below her, 2 floors down in a level that existed on no civic record, the men Dominic had hired for the Sora Gallery were still being interviewed. She did not think about what that sounded like. Betty stood alone in the back office. She put the matte black phone in her bag, next to her lip balm and her planner. She picked up her Louis Vuitton bag from the desk. She straightened the dark cardigan. May J was still in the doorway. "You told me," he said, "that sufficient was him leaving the building breathing." "Yes," she said. "Not mercy," he said. "Precision." She considered this. He'll spend every remaining day knowing that everything he was frightened of in that room is still there, still watching. That's not mercy, that's a more permanent sentence than anything else we could have handed him. May J looked at her across the small office with the focused, uncluttered attention that she had come to understand was his highest form of regard, the look that meant he was not managing her or assessing her, but simply seeing her, entirely, without the social static that obscured most people from each other. "Come," he said. "There are things to finalize." The things that were finalized happened over the following 2 weeks, in the quiet, precise rhythm that characterized everything in May J's world. Contracts not the kind filed with a Secretary of State, but the kind that held with the specific gravity of a man's reputation and the infrastructure built around it. Betty's position in the inner circle was formalized in the way things in that world were formalized, through action, through demonstrated authority, through the way the 6 men around the oval table now looked at her when she spoke, not with the careful neutrality of that first meeting, with the particular quality of attention given to someone whose judgment has proven expensive to underestimate. Park Soo, on the 3rd day, brought her coffee without being asked and set it down the way May J's people set things down with both hands, clean and precise, and said nothing else. Betty understood this as the equivalent, in Park Soo's emotional vocabulary, of a standing ovation. The Hanul arrangement produced a secondary benefit that Betty had not anticipated and May J had, she suspected, foreseen entirely: Dominic's departure from the city within 10 days. She learned this from the matte black phone, tracking the dot of him as it moved farther, day by day, from the metropolitan area, until it settled in a secondary city 300 miles away, where he had family and significantly fewer options. She watched the dot stabilize there, and felt nothing dramatic, not triumph, not relief in the Hollywood sense. Something quieter. The specific, cellular ease of a body that has been braced for impact for 6 years and has finally, at last, been given permission to unclench. She told May J on a Tuesday evening, in his office, the city dark and wet through the high windows. "He's gone," she said. May J looked up from his desk. "Yes," he said. "I know. You've been watching the phone, too." "I've been watching the phone since I gave it to you," he said, without a trace of apology. She should have been irritated by this. She was not. She stood at the window with the city moving below her in its indifferent midnight way, and she thought about the woman who had walked into a boutique 3.5 months ago to buy something beautiful for herself, and been knocked to the floor, and reached out her hand to be lifted by a stranger whose stillness in the center of the chaos had been more terrifying than the chaos itself. That woman was not gone. She was not erased or replaced. She was present in every room Betty occupied, but no longer as the organizing principle of Betty's behavior, no longer the one with her hand on the wheel. "I want to talk about the hospitality portfolio," Betty said, "specifically the variance in the Busan-linked accounts. I think there's a more elegant structure." Mei-jae set down what he was reading. "Sit down," he said. She sat not in the chair across the desk, which was where visitors sat, but in the one angled beside it, which was where she sat now, which had become, in the last several weeks, simply where she sat. He turned his chair slightly toward her, and the desk lamp put its amber light across both of them. And outside, the city continued its reliable indifference to the things that changed inside high buildings at midnight. Betty opened her notebook analog. Always. Because she had learned from Mei-jae that the most important things were kept in forms that could not be remotely accessed, and walked him through what she'd found in the account structure. He listened with the full quality of his attention, asking 2 precise questions, and the second one led her to a realization she hadn't had before, which she articulated in real time. And he watched her do it with the expression she had catalogued as the closest thing to warmth his face produced, not almost a smile this time, but something that occupied the same latitude. When she finished, he said, "You'll present that to the full circle on Friday." "I know," she said. "Park Soo will have notes. Park Soo always has notes." A silence easy, the kind that had stopped needing to be filled weeks ago. Betty closed the notebook. Outside, rain had begun, the city's lights fracturing and multiplying against the wet glass. "You knew," she said, "from the beginning, how the boutique was going to resolve. Not the specifics," he said, "but the shape of it." He considered this with the honesty she had come to rely on the absolute absence of flattering revision. "I knew what you were capable of," he said. "I knew the situation would require you to access it. I did not know exactly how or when. And if I'd made a different choice? At the restaurant? Or at Hanul? Then I would have handled Dominic Cole through other means," he said. "And we would have parted ways. And I would have been wrong about you." A pause. "I'm rarely wrong." Betty looked at him in the amber light. At the navy suit and the silver watch and the dark eyes that were, she now knew completely. Not cold. Simply honest in a way that most people experienced as cold, because they had never been seen clearly before and found it disorienting. "I know," she said. She meant it about more than his judgment. He looked at her with the focused, uncluttered attention that had no social static in it, and she looked back at him with the steadiness she had built from the floor of a boutique upward. And the rain moved across the high windows, and neither of them addressed what occupied the air between them in the way of things that have been true for a while and are simply waiting, without urgency, for the right moment. "Friday," he said finally. "Full circle. Don't be late." "I'm never late," Betty said, standing, gathering her notebook and her bag. "No," he agreed. "You're not." She walked to the door. At the threshold she paused, not turning a habit she'd absorbed, perhaps from him, or perhaps from the part of herself that had learned to deliver the last word and mean it. Mei-jae. "Yes. The Busan variance, I think it's bigger than I showed you tonight. I'll have the full picture by Thursday." A pause. "Good night, Betty," he said. She left. The door closed behind her with the soft, weighted click of a well-made thing operating exactly as intended. In the elevator, descending, she caught her reflection in the mirrored doors. Long, dark braids, dark cardigan, the Louis Vuitton bag on her arm. The same elements. A completely different woman wearing them. Not harder, not colder, clearer, the way a window is clearer after rain. All the accumulated distortion of 6 years wiped from the glass, and underneath it, simply herself. Precise, capable, unafraid. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Betty Miller walked out into the rain.